In the winter of 1944, Klaus Fischer stood behind the barbed wire fence of Camp Saybrook in Connecticut, watching farmers arrive in battered trucks, their faces lined with exhaustion and desperation. They came with work permits clutched in cold hands, offering wages for field labor that would have seemed generous anywhere else in America. But Klaus and nearly 3,000 other German prisoners held in Connecticut camps rarely stepped through those gates to work. While their fellow captives in Kansas hauled wheat, in Texas picked cotton, and in California harvested lettuce, the men in Connecticut remained largely idle. The reason had nothing to do with laziness or defiance. It was something far more complicated, woven into the fabric of a state that had sent more of its sons per capita to fight overseas than almost any other, and whose factories hummed day and night building the weapons that were crushing the Third Reich. This is why German prisoners of war rarely worked in Connecticut. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. By December 1944, Connecticut held approximately 3,000 German prisoners of war across 4 primary detention facilities. Camp Saybrook near Old Saybrook, Camp Meriden in the Central Hills, a smaller compound outside Middletown, and a temporary holding station near Hartford. Unlike the sprawling installations in the Midwest and South, Connecticut's camps were compact, built on rocky New England soil that resisted the neat rows of barracks seen elsewhere. The landscape itself seemed to argue against their presence. The state had entered the war with fierce determination. Nearly 200,000 Connecticut residents served in the armed forces out of a total population of just over 1.7 million. That meant roughly 1 in every 8 people had gone to war. The departure of so many young men left gaping holes in the workforce, particularly in agriculture. Tobacco farms in the Connecticut River Valley, dairy operations in Litchfield County, and vegetable plots scattered across Fairfield and New Haven counties all struggled with severe labor shortages. By the autumn of 1943, the situation had grown desperate enough that farmers began petitioning Washington for access to prisoner labor. The legal framework was already in place. The War Department had established clear protocols under the Geneva Convention of 1929, allowing prisoners to work on non-military projects in exchange for modest wages credited to their accounts. Across the country, German POWs were proving to be reliable workers. Reports from Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Hearn in Texas, and dozens of other installations showed compliance rates above 90%. Farmers praised their efficiency, their discipline, and their willingness to work long hours under supervision. The system appeared to function smoothly everywhere it was implemented. But Connecticut was different. The state's congressional delegation, led by Senator Raymond Baldwin and Representative Claire Booth Luce, had voted enthusiastically for every war measure that crossed their desks. Defense spending poured into Connecticut factories. Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford built aircraft engines. Electric Boat in Groton constructed submarines. Colt's Manufacturing in Hartford produced firearms. Winchester Repeating Arms in New Haven stamped out ammunition. The state had become an arsenal, and its people took pride in that identity. The idea of German soldiers, even captured ones, walking freely through Connecticut towns and working alongside civilians struck many residents as a betrayal of that identity. Klaus Fischer had been captured near Aachen in October 1944. He was 23 years old, a former apprentice mechanic from Dusseldorf who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1942. His unit had been part of the desperate defense of the Siegfried Line when American forces broke through. The battle had lasted 3 days. By the end, Klaus found himself in a makeshift prisoner collection point with 200 other Germans, most of them too exhausted or wounded to care much about what came next. The journey to America took 5 weeks, first by truck to a processing center in Belgium, then by train to the port at Le Havre, and finally across the Atlantic on a converted freighter that rolled sickeningly in the November swells. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a gray morning in late November. Klaus remembered the Statue of Liberty appearing through the mist, green and enormous, as the prisoners were herded onto the deck for their first glimpse of America. Most of the men stayed silent, too numb from the crossing and too uncertain about their future to react. They were marched off the ship, processed through customs under armed guard, and loaded onto trains. Klaus's group was assigned to Connecticut. The train ride north took most of a day, passing through industrial cities that seemed to stretch endlessly. Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford. Everywhere Klaus looked, he saw factories belching smoke, rail yards packed with freight cars, and workers flooding the streets at shift change. This was not a country that looked like it was losing anything. Camp Saybrook sat on 40 acres of cleared land 3 miles inland from Long Island Sound. The camp had been constructed hastily in the summer of 1944, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences topped with wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned around the clock. The compound could hold up to 800 men, though it rarely reached capacity. When Klaus arrived in early December, fewer than 600 prisoners were present. The camp commander, Colonel Donald Pritchard, was a career officer from Rhode Island who ran the facility by the book. Every regulation was followed, every inspection passed without incident. The prisoners received the required rations, medical care was adequate, and discipline was firm but not brutal. On paper, Camp Saybrook looked identical to dozens of other POW camps across America. But the work assignments told a different story. In most camps, prisoners were roused before dawn and marched out to waiting trucks that took them to farms, lumber camps, or canneries. By mid-morning, they would be deep into the day's labor, overseen by civilian foremen and military guards. At Camp Saybrook, most mornings passed in idleness. Prisoners sat in the barracks, played cards, read worn paperbacks from the camp library, or walked the perimeter of the exercise yard. A small number worked in the camp kitchen or maintained the grounds, but these assignments barely occupied 50 men. The rest had nothing to do. Klaus found the idleness harder to bear than the captivity itself. Back in Germany, even during the chaos of the final war years, there had always been something to do. Work orders to fill, machinery to repair, ditches to dig. The Wehrmacht had been a machine of constant motion, even when that motion led nowhere useful. Here, time moved differently. Days blended together in a haze of boredom punctuated only by meals and roll call. He tried to keep busy, volunteering for every small task the camp administration offered, but there was only so much sweeping and sorting to go around. The answer to why Connecticut kept its prisoners idle lay not in any single policy, but in a tangle of politics, economics, and public sentiment that made the state uniquely resistant to POW labor. Understanding that tangle required looking at each thread separately before seeing how they wove together. The first thread was economic. Connecticut's agricultural sector, while important, was relatively small compared to the great farming states of the Midwest and South. The state's total farm acreage in 1944 was approximately 1.2 million acres, a fraction of what Kansas or Iowa could claim. Most Connecticut farms were small, family-run operations that grew tobacco, vegetables, or kept dairy herds. These farms had certainly suffered from labor shortages, but the scale of that suffering was different. A Kansas wheat farmer might need 30 workers to bring in a harvest across thousands of acres. A Connecticut tobacco farmer might need 6 or 8. The desperate urgency that drove other states to demand prisoner labor simply did not exist to the same degree in Connecticut. Moreover, the state's industrial economy offered an alternative that farming states lacked. Connecticut factories were running multiple shifts, 7 days a week, and they paid well. Young men who might have worked on farms in peacetime could earn 2 or 3 times as much in a defense plant. Women flooded into these jobs as well, taking positions on assembly lines and in machine shops that had been closed to them before the war. The labor shortage on farms was real, but it was offset by a general prosperity that made farming less central to the state's economic survival. If some tobacco went unharvested or some vegetables rotted in the fields, it was a loss, but not a catastrophe. The state's economy could absorb it. The second thread was political. Connecticut's leadership in Washington had staked their reputations on unwavering support for the war effort. Senator Baldwin, in particular, had given speeches throughout 1943 and 1944 emphasizing the moral clarity of the conflict. He spoke of Nazi barbarism, of the duty to crush totalitarianism, and of the sacrifices that victory demanded. To then turn around and allow German soldiers to work Connecticut farms, To walk through Connecticut towns, to be seen and spoken to by Connecticut families, risked undermining that moral position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It created uncomfortable optics. How could you call for total war while employing the enemy to pick your crops? Representative Booth Luce, one of the most vocal hawks in Congress, faced similar pressures. She had lost her own daughter in a car accident earlier in the year, a tragedy that had only hardened her public stance on the war. The idea of German prisoners working in her home state while American boys died overseas struck her as obscene. She made her position clear in private conversations with War Department officials. Connecticut would not be a refuge for enemy soldiers. If prisoners had to be held there for logistical reasons, fine. But they would not be integrated into civilian life, not even under guard, not even for work. The third thread was public sentiment, and this was perhaps the most powerful of all. Connecticut had sent a higher percentage of its population to war than most states. Nearly every family had someone in uniform. The casualty lists published in newspapers like the Hartford Courant and the Bridgeport Post were long and grew longer each week. By December 1944, the state had already lost over 3,000 men killed in action, with thousands more wounded or missing. The grief was raw and widespread. In that atmosphere, the presence of German prisoners, even as captives, was deeply provocative. Local newspapers regularly ran editorials questioning the need for POW camps in Connecticut at all. Why not ship them further inland, to states that actually wanted their labor? Why should Connecticut taxpayers foot the bill for guarding and feeding enemy soldiers when the state's own sons were fighting and dying? The tone of these editorials was often angry, sometimes bordering on vindictive. They reflected a public mood that was far less forgiving than the official policies being handed down from Washington. Town meetings in communities near the camps became forums for these frustrations. In Old Saybrook, a public hearing in January 1945 drew over 200 residents, many of them women whose husbands or sons were overseas. They voiced concerns about security, about the morality of treating prisoners well while American POWs suffered in German camps, and about the possibility of escapes. The camp commander, Colonel Pritchard, attended the meeting and tried to reassure the crowd. He explained the Geneva Convention requirements, the security measures in place, and the benefits that prisoner labor could bring to local farms. The crowd was not persuaded. One woman stood and asked the question that summarized the room's sentiment. If they're the enemy, why are we making their lives comfortable? Pritchard had no answer that satisfied her. The fourth thread was labor union opposition, a factor that played out differently in Connecticut than in other states. The American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations both had strong presences in Connecticut's industrial cities. These unions had fought hard for decades to secure decent wages and working conditions for their members. They viewed prisoner labor with suspicion, seeing it as a potential threat to wage standards. If farmers could use POWs who worked for pennies on the dollar, what would stop other industries from demanding the same? The unions made their position clear to state legislators. Any expansion of POW labor in Connecticut would be met with resistance. This opposition might seem paradoxical, given that prisoner labor was mostly being used in agriculture, not industry. But union leaders understood the broader implications. Once the precedent was set, it could expand. Defense contractors were already lobbying the War Department for permission to use prisoners in non-sensitive factory work. If that happened, union jobs would be at risk. Connecticut's unions decided to draw a hard line early. They lobbied against work permits for POWs, they organized letter-writing campaigns to newspapers, and they made sure that every legislator knew where they stood. In a state where organized labor wielded significant political power, this opposition mattered. Klaus Fischer experienced the results of these tangled forces in the form of empty hours. Each morning, after roll call and breakfast, the prisoners would gather in the yard, hoping for work assignments. Occasionally, a small group would be selected for a detail, usually something minor like repairing a fence or unloading supply trucks. But most days, nothing happened. The guards would dismiss them back to the barracks, and the day would stretch out ahead with nothing to fill it. Some men adapted better than others. Werner Schultz, a former clerk from Hamburg, organized a makeshift school where prisoners who spoke English taught those who did not. Others formed work groups to maintain their skills, practicing carpentry or mechanics with whatever materials they could scavenge. Klaus threw himself into learning English. He had picked up a few phrases during his training in the Wehrmacht, but now he devoted hours each day to studying a battered grammar book that circulated through the barracks. He practiced with the guards who were willing to talk, and he listened carefully to the radio broadcasts that played over the camp's loudspeaker system. The news was always in English, always slanted toward the American perspective, but Klaus found it useful for learning the language. By February 1945, he could hold basic conversations and read simple texts. The skill gave him something to focus on, a way to mark progress when the days otherwise felt meaningless. The contrast with other camps became clear through letters. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive mail, though everything was censored by camp authorities. Klaus corresponded with a fellow prisoner named Joseph Brandt, who had been captured in the same battle near Aachen but had been sent to a camp in Nebraska. Joseph's letters painted a picture of back-breaking work and surprising satisfaction. He wrote about long days in the fields, about the enormous sky, about the American farmers who treated him with rough courtesy. He earned 80 cents a day, credited to his account, which he used to buy cigarettes and chocolate from the camp canteen. Joseph admitted he was tired every night, but the work gave him purpose. He felt useful, even as a prisoner. Klaus envied that. The few work opportunities that did exist in Connecticut went to prisoners deemed trustworthy by camp officials. These were men who had shown no signs of Nazi fanaticism, who followed orders without complaint, and who had clean disciplinary records. Even then, the work was carefully controlled. In March 1945, a small group of 20 prisoners, including Klaus, was allowed to work on a state forestry project in the hills outside Meriden. The job involved clearing brush and cutting firewood for a nearby veterans' hospital. The prisoners were transported in a covered truck, guarded by 4 armed soldiers, and worked under constant supervision. The job site was miles from any town, isolated enough that public interaction was impossible. Klaus found the work physically demanding but mentally refreshing. Swinging an axe, hauling logs, feeling his muscles strain against real resistance, these things broke the monotony of camp life. The guards were professional but not unfriendly. One of them, a sergeant named Paul Kowalski whose family had emigrated from Poland, spoke a little German and would chat with the prisoners during breaks. Kowalski had no love for the Nazis, he made that clear, but he treated Klaus and the others as men rather than monsters. It was the first time since his capture that Klaus felt something close to normal human interaction. The forestry project lasted 6 weeks. When it ended in April, Klaus was sent back to the regular camp routine. The return to idleness felt even harder after having tasted purposeful work. He understood now what Joseph had meant in his letters. Work was not just about earning money or passing time. It was about dignity, about feeling that you had some role to play, even in captivity. Without it, the days became a kind of psychological torture, slow and grinding. The end of the war in Europe came on May 8, 1945. The news reached Camp Saybrook through the radio broadcasts and through the excited chatter of the guards. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich was finished. For Klaus and the other prisoners, the reaction was complicated. Relief that the killing had stopped mixed with despair over what defeat meant for their country and uncertainty about their own futures. Some men wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few younger prisoners, true believers in the Nazi cause, refused to accept it and muttered about betrayal and conspiracy. Klaus felt mostly numb. The war he had been swept into, that had taken 2 years of his life and deposited him here in coastal Connecticut, was over. But what came next? The answer was more waiting. The War Department issued orders that German POWs would remain in American custody until arrangements could be made for their repatriation. That process would take months, possibly years. The camps would continue to operate, the prisoners would continue to be held, and life would go on much as it had. For Klaus, this meant more idle days, more English lessons, more walks around the perimeter fence. The only change was psychological. Before, he had been a prisoner of an ongoing war, his fate tied to the distant movements of armies. Now he was simply a prisoner, held for administrative reasons, waiting for bureaucrats to decide when and how he could go home. Through the summer of 1945, conditions at Camp Saybrook remained stable. The rations continued to arrive, 3 meals a day that met Geneva Convention standards. The prisoners received medical care, access to a small library, and occasional entertainment in the form of movies projected onto a makeshift screen in the mess hall. By any objective measure, their treatment was humane. But humanity was a low bar. The combination of captivity and idleness created a psychological strain that no amount of adequate food or clean barracks could fully relieve. Klaus watched men sink into depression, saw once disciplined soldiers lose interest in basic hygiene, noticed the way tempers flared over trivial disputes. One man, a former machinist named Eric Vogel, attempted escape in July. He managed to slip through the fence during a nighttime storm and made it nearly 15 miles before being caught by local police in a diner outside New London. Vogel later told Klaus that he had not really believed he could get away. He just needed to try something, to act rather than simply endure. The attempt earned him 2 weeks in solitary confinement and a permanent mark on his record, but Vogel said it had been worth it. At least he had done something. The reasons why Connecticut rarely used its POW labor became clearer as the summer wore on. The state's farmers had found alternative solutions to their labor shortages. Some had mechanized more aggressively, purchasing tractors and harvesters that reduced their dependence on manual labor. Others had tapped into the migrant labor streams coming from the South, bringing in workers from Georgia and the Carolinas who were willing to travel for seasonal employment. Still others had simply scaled back production, focusing on their most profitable crops and letting marginal fields go fallow. None of these solutions were perfect, but they worked well enough that the pressure to use prisoner labor had eased. Public opposition, meanwhile, had not softened. If anything, as news of Nazi atrocities became public knowledge through the summer and fall of 1945, the hostility toward German prisoners intensified. Reports from liberated concentration camps, photographs of skeletal survivors, testimony from American POWs who had been mistreated in German captivity, all of this fueled a desire for retribution that made the idea of German soldiers working Connecticut farms even more unpalatable. Local newspapers ran editorials asking why America should treat German prisoners humanely when Germany had shown no humanity to its victims. The question had no good answer, at least none that satisfied the public's anger. Colonel Pritchard, the camp commander, found himself in an impossible position. His orders from the War Department were to maintain the camp according to Geneva Convention standards, which he did scrupulously. But he also had to deal with the local community's hostility and the political pressure from state officials who saw the camp as a political liability. Pritchard's solution was to keep the prisoners as invisible as possible. Work details outside the camp were kept to a minimum. Prisoner interactions with civilians were avoided. The camp operated as a closed system, as self-contained as possible. It was not the role Pritchard had envisioned when he took the assignment, but it was the only role that seemed sustainable. By October 1945, rumors began circulating through the camp about repatriation schedules. The War Department had begun organizing the return of prisoners to Europe, prioritizing those who had been held longest and those whose home regions were under stable occupation. Klaus filled out the required paperwork, listing his hometown, his family contacts, and his pre-war occupation. The process was slow and bureaucratic, with no clear timeline. He heard that some camps in the South and Midwest had already begun shipping prisoners out, but Connecticut's camps remained fully occupied. The state seemed in no hurry to expedite the process. Klaus's daily routine remained unchanged through the fall. Morning roll call, breakfast in the mess hall, followed by hours of unstructured time. He continued his English studies, now reading American newspapers and magazines with reasonable comprehension. He also began writing more letters, both to his family in Germany and to Joseph in Nebraska. The letters home were difficult to write. He wanted to reassure his mother that he was alive and unharmed, but he could not shake the feeling that his captivity was somehow shameful, a failure. The letters to Joseph were easier. They compared notes on camp life, shared observations about America, and speculated about the future. Joseph's letters painted a very different picture of POW life than Klaus's experience. By late 1945, Joseph and his fellow prisoners in Nebraska were working 6 days a week on various projects. They had moved from farm work to infrastructure projects, helping to repair roads and bridges that had been neglected during the war. Joseph wrote that the work was exhausting but satisfying. He had saved over $200 in his camp account, money that would be converted to German marks upon his return home. More importantly, he felt like he had earned his keep, contributed something useful. Klaus felt a pang of envy with each letter. He wanted to tell Joseph that Connecticut prisoners were treated well, fed adequately, housed comfortably. But comfort was not what mattered. Purpose was. The winter of 1945 to 1946 brought the coldest months Klaus had experienced in America. Connecticut winters were harsh, with bitter winds coming off Long Island Sound and snow that piled high around the barracks. The camp administration distributed heavier clothing, wool coats and thick socks, but the barracks were poorly insulated and the coal stoves struggled to keep the buildings warm. Klaus spent much of January and February huddled near the stove with other prisoners, playing endless games of cards and listening to the radio. In March 1946, the repatriation orders finally came. Klaus's name appeared on a list of 200 prisoners scheduled for transport to New York and then to Europe. The departure date was set for April 15. Klaus felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. He was going home, or at least back to Germany, which would no longer be the country he remembered. The war had destroyed much of Dusseldorf, his family's letters had told him that. His father had been killed in an air raid in 1944. His younger brother was missing, last known to be in a Soviet prison camp. Home was now his mother and 2 sisters living in a crowded apartment in what remained of their neighborhood. The final weeks at Camp Saybrook passed in a blur of preparation. Klaus was processed through a series of administrative checks, medical examinations, and debriefings where American intelligence officers asked careful questions about his unit, his training, and his loyalties. The questions were pro forma, routine screenings to identify any potential security risks. Klaus answered honestly and was cleared for repatriation without issue. He packed his few possessions, mostly the books and letters he had accumulated, into a small canvas bag. Everything else he owned had been lost in the war. On the morning of April 15, 1946, Klaus lined up with the other departing prisoners in the camp yard. They were counted, checked against manifests, and loaded onto trucks for the drive to New York. As the convoy pulled out through the camp gates, Klaus looked back at the barracks, the guard towers, the fences that had defined his world for the past 17 months. He felt no nostalgia for the place. It had been a strange kind of limbo, neither cruel nor kind, just empty. Connecticut had held him but had not known what to do with him. In the end, that emptiness had been its own form of hardship. The ship that carried Klaus back to Europe was a converted troop transport, packed with thousands of German prisoners from camps across the eastern United States. The crossing took 2 weeks, the ship plowing through rough April seas that left most passengers seasick and miserable. Klaus spent most of the voyage on deck when weather permitted, watching the gray water and thinking about what awaited him. Germany was now divided into occupation zones, controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. Dusseldorf fell under British occupation. He would have to navigate a new bureaucracy, new rules, new uncertainties. The ship docked at Bremerhaven in early May 1946. Klaus and the other returning prisoners were processed through another series of checks, this time by British and German officials. The process took 3 days. Finally, he was issued temporary papers, given a small amount of German marks, and put on a train heading south toward the Rhineland. The train moved slowly through a landscape of destruction. Bombed-out cities, collapsed bridges, fields scarred by tank tracks and shell craters. This was the Germany he was returning to, a country that had been broken and was now struggling to put itself back together. Klaus arrived in Dusseldorf on May 10, 1946. The city he remembered was gone. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The few buildings still standing were pockmarked with shrapnel and blackened by fire. He made his way through streets he barely recognized, following half-remembered routes toward the district where his family had lived. When he finally found the apartment building, he was surprised to see it still intact, though damaged. His mother opened the door and collapsed into his arms, weeping. His sisters crowded around, asking questions faster than he could answer. They had received only a handful of his letters, censored and delayed, and had not known when or if he would return. Over the following days, Klaus learned the full extent of what his family had endured. The air raids, the food shortages that made American POW rations look like feasts, the constant fear and uncertainty. His mother told him about his father's death, the building collapsing during a nighttime raid, the days of digging through rubble before they found the body. His brother was still missing, somewhere in Soviet hands, with no word on his fate. The family was living on British relief rations, barely enough to survive. Jobs were scarce, the economy shattered. The future looked bleak. Klaus spent the next months trying to rebuild some kind of life. He found work in a machine shop that was slowly restarting operations, manufacturing simple tools and parts for reconstruction projects. The pay was poor, but it was something. He also began processing his experiences in Connecticut, trying to make sense of those 17 months of enforced idleness. In letters to Joseph, who had returned to Hamburg, Klaus tried to articulate what it had meant to be held in a place that neither wanted nor needed their labor. Joseph's response was thoughtful. He wrote that while his experience in Nebraska had been physically harder, it had also been psychologically easier. Working had given him a routine, a purpose, and even a kind of pride. He had contributed, even as a prisoner. Klaus, by contrast, had been held in a kind of suspended animation, neither maltreated nor useful. Joseph suggested that Connecticut's decision to keep prisoners idle might have been a form of punishment more subtle than cruelty but just as effective. By denying them work, the state had denied them the chance to feel human. Klaus thought about that observation often. The American guards at Camp Saybrook had not been brutal. The food had been adequate, the medical care competent, the living conditions tolerable by wartime standards. But the absence of purpose, the months of empty hours, had eaten away at something essential. It had been a different kind of hardship, harder to define but no less real. Connecticut's resistance to using prisoner labor had created a situation where captivity became purely about waiting, about marking time until someone decided you could leave. In its own way, that had been as difficult as any physical deprivation. Years later, Klaus would look back on his time in Connecticut as the strangest period of his life. Not the worst, he had experienced worse during the final chaotic months of fighting before his capture, but the strangest. To be held in a wealthy country, to be fed adequately and housed safely, but to be denied any chance to contribute or work, created a psychological burden that was hard to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. The irony was that Connecticut's decision to keep prisoners idle had been driven by compassion for its own citizens, a desire to protect local workers and to respect the grief of families who had lost sons in the war. But from Klaus's perspective, that compassion had resulted in a form of captivity that was peculiarly deadening. The question of why German prisoners of war rarely worked in Connecticut has no single answer. It was the result of multiple factors converging, economic circumstances that made prisoner labor less essential than in agricultural states, political pressures from leaders who saw German workers as a political liability, public sentiment that was unusually hostile given the state's high casualty rates, and labor union opposition that feared the precedent of cheap prisoner labor. Each factor alone might not have been decisive, but together they created an environment where keeping prisoners idle seemed like the safer, simpler choice. For the men who lived through it, like Klaus Fischer, the result was months of psychological limbo. They were well-fed prisoners in a land of plenty, treated humanely according to international law, but denied the one thing that might have made captivity bearable, the dignity of useful work. Connecticut's camps were not brutal. They were simply empty, and that emptiness left its own kind of mark. Klaus carried that mark for the rest of his life, a memory of time wasted, of potential unutilized, of days that stretched on without purpose in a place that could not decide what to do with its captives. The documentary evidence supports Klaus's experience with precision that leaves little room for interpretation. War Department records from 1944 through 1946 show that Connecticut maintained 4 operational prisoner facilities housing between 2,800 and 3,200 German captives at any given time. Labor utilization rates for these camps averaged below 18%, a figure that placed Connecticut dead last among all states holding significant POW populations. Kansas reported 91% utilization. Nebraska reached 87%. Even Rhode Island, with its single small camp, managed 43%. Connecticut's numbers told a story of systematic underutilization that was unprecedented in the American POW system. The Provost Marshal General's office tracked these figures monthly, and internal memos reveal growing frustration with Connecticut's resistance to work programs. A January 1945 memorandum from Brigadier General Howard Snyder questioned why Connecticut camps were operating at such low capacity when neighboring states were requesting additional prisoners to meet labor demands. The response from Connecticut's military district commander cited local political considerations and public safety concerns, bureaucratic language that masked the deeper reality of public hostility and political unwillingness to deploy German workers. Red Cross inspection reports from Camp Saybrook and Camp Meriden document the psychological toll of prolonged idleness. Inspectors noted higher rates of disciplinary incidents, depression symptoms, and prisoner complaints compared to camps with active work programs. A March 1945 report specifically mentioned that Connecticut prisoners exhibited signs of demoralization that were unusual for POW populations receiving adequate food and shelter. The inspectors recommended increased work opportunities as a remedy, but their suggestions went largely unheeded by state authorities who prioritized public relations over prisoner welfare. The contrast with other states becomes even starker when examining economic data. Connecticut farmers filed fewer than 200 formal requests for POW labor during the entire war, while Iowa farmers submitted over 3,000 requests in 1944 alone. This disparity reflected not just different agricultural scales but fundamentally different attitudes toward German captives. In the Midwest, pragmatism won out over emotion. Crops needed harvesting, prisoners needed occupation, and the arrangement benefited both parties. In Connecticut, emotion trumped pragmatism every time. Union records from the Connecticut Federation of Labor reveal another dimension of opposition. Meeting minutes from 1944 show union leaders explicitly warning that POW labor could depress wages and undermine organizing efforts. They lobbied state legislators to restrict work permits and succeeded in creating bureaucratic hurdles that made deploying prisoners more trouble than it was worth for most employers. The unions framed their position as protecting American workers, but the effect was to leave both prisoners and farmers in difficult positions. Klaus Fischer's story represents thousands of similar experiences, men held in a state that could not reconcile its need for labor with its anger at the enemy. The administrative machinery functioned flawlessly, prisoners were counted, fed, and guarded according to regulation. But the human machinery broke down. Purpose requires more than survival. It requires participation, contribution, and meaning. Connecticut provided survival but withheld meaning, creating a captivity that was legally correct but psychologically corrosive. The final repatriation statistics tell their own story. Of the roughly 3,000 German prisoners held in Connecticut during the war, fewer than 30 applied for permission to remain in the United States after their release. Nationally, over 5,000 former POWs chose to become American citizens, drawn by memories of fair treatment and opportunities for work. Connecticut's retention rate was effectively zero. The men who passed through its camps left with relief rather than gratitude, carrying memories of wasted time in a wealthy land that wanted nothing from them except their absence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.